putting recycled content into the packaging reduces its environmental impact. So that's a good thing. And the same is true for all the other materials. Going from no recycled content to higher recycled content reduces the environmental impact. But over here on the right, we have this molded pulp loose fill. Okay, that's made, it's like those egg cartons, except it's a loose fill. It's made from 100% recycled newsprint. It's totally recyclable. You would think it would be the best choice. But it turns out that the amount of natural gas required to dry the molded pulp is so large that at the end of the day, this option has the greatest amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? So what we see here is that recycled content and recyclability don't correlate well with broader environmental impacts. So let me be very clear on this point. If you have a discard, it's generally better to recycle it than to dispose of it. That's a decision you make at the point of discard. If you're buying a material and you know what it is you're going to buy, that's a purchasing decision. There are typically environmental benefits associated with increasing the recycled content of that material. If you're buying copy paper, okay, or if you're buying, a cardboard box or something like that. But where we run into trouble is where consumers start comparing two different materials, okay? Two different void fills, or boxes versus shipping bags that could provide the same function. At that point, recycled content and recyclability don't correlate well at all, and we really shouldn't use them as purchasing criteria if we're trying to reduce the environmental impacts of the stuff that we produce and the stuff we consume. Let's talk for just a minute about degradable products. This is an area that's attracted a lot of attention. People are really concerned around litter and the impacts of products in the environment that don't degrade. Lifecycle analysis is not well suited to evaluate the impacts of materials that are littered. There's just a lot we don't know about litter. It's surprising how little we know about litter, really. Despite that, there's a lot of interest in degradable products, and one of the common justifications for them is because they will break down in landfills. Now, 30 years ago, this country had a serious landfill shortage, and some parts of the country still do, but Oregon does not. Oregon has hundreds of years of landfill capacity. That didn't used to be the case. And so many years ago, when we were trying to preserve our landfills, it made sense to put things in them and make them degrade so that we would have more airspace to put our garbage. That's really not a very compelling reason anymore. We have a new awareness about landfills, and that they are a source of methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. And methane only occurs when things degrade. So if your concern is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you really don't want things degrading in landfills. But all of this aside, we're just talking about the downstream impacts. Remember what I said earlier about upstream being more important. So if we're talking about degradable products, what does it take to make them? That's a question that people rarely ask, but they should, and let me explain why. As part of our drinking water study, we compared a non-degradable but recyclable PET, polyethylene terephthalate bottle, against a bottle made of a resin, a new resin, a bioresin called PLA, or polylactic acid. You may have heard of it called corn plastic. Some of the delis use it. You may even use them here on campus, I'm not sure. It's called PLA. It's a plastic made from corn. And so looking just at water bottles, what we're comparing here are some of the different environmental impacts associated with PLA that gets disposed of, PLA that gets composted at a rate of 62%, or the alternative, the fossil-derived PET that gets recycled at a rate of 62%. So if we look at ecotoxicity, this is the impact over the life cycle that the pollution has on, amphibians and birds and things like that. The PLA is a better choice. Now, the solid colors on this graph represent emissions upstream of the consumer. The lightly shaded colors represent impacts downstream of the consumer. So again, upstream dominates, downstream hardly registers for both the PLA and the PET. So if your concern is ecotoxicity, this corn plastic is a better choice over PET for drinking water bottles. If your concern is eutrophication, the release of nitrogen, phosphorus, et cetera, into water bodies, algae blooms, ocean dead zones, et cetera, PLA isn't a very good choice. which makes sense when you think about it. PLA is made from corn. Corn agriculture in the Midwest is a major contributor to runoff into the Mississippi River and a contributor to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So this result isn't too surprising. Again, note, however, that the upstream impacts dominate, and that whether you dispose or compost the material, frankly, doesn't make a whole lot of difference for this impact category. Global warming is one where we actually are missing a key piece of information, and that is what happens to the PLA when it goes into the landfill. Does it degrade, or does it just sit there? A lot of people would like it to degrade. Intuitively, that's the right thing to do, right? We want things to degrade in landfills. What if it doesn't? If it doesn't degrade in the landfill, then it doesn't produce methane. And so if you put it in the landfill and it doesn't produce methane, and the carbon that was previously circulating between the cornfield and the atmosphere, it gets locked up inside the landfill, it's sort of like taking oil out of the ground and burning it, except in reverse. It's taking carbon that used to be in the atmosphere and putting it in the landfill and keeping it there. So if it doesn't degrade, it's a pretty good choice. Better even than composting, surprisingly. And if it does degrade and it gives off methane, even though landfills in Oregon capture a fair amount of methane and use it to generate, energy, some of the methane still escapes. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And based on our estimates, it's a very bad choice to buy this biodegradable plastic and put it in the landfill from a greenhouse gas perspective. Let's talk, because we're running short on time here, about just a few more attributes that people get pretty excited about. One is local. Is local better from an environmental perspective? Mind you, I'm not talking about the other two pillars of sustainability, society and community and economy here, but just the environmental one. We would like to believe that we're doing the environment a great favor by buying things that are local, because, popular wisdom goes, we're reducing the impacts of transportation. So what are the impacts of transportation? Let's look. These are greenhouse gas emissions, including the emissions associated with transporting products, for 4 major commodities in the US: aluminum, steel, newsprint, and carpet. These are pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of product. And this includes the emissions associated with transporting all the stuff throughout the entire supply chain, all the way up to the point of production. Okay? So what happens if we added more transportation? What happens if, say, all this stuff got shipped all the way, across the Pacific Ocean in an ocean freighter? How much would that add to the greenhouse gas, to the carbon footprint of these products? That much is how much it would add. Not much at all. So the idea that local is better because it eliminates transportation impacts isn't a very solid idea. Yes, it does reduce transportation impacts, but the reduction is fairly trivial. Here's another example looking at rice. In blue, we have the energy required to produce rice using 2 different methods in 2 different geographies. On the left, we have traditional deep water rice grown in Bangladesh, which is watered by the monsoon. And on the right, we have rice grown in the United States using high levels of inputs and irrigation, which has to be pumped. Nature grows rice very well and very efficiently in Bangladesh. And even if you have to then ship the rice to the United States in an ocean freighter, it doesn't tip the scales. It's still a lower impact product from an energy perspective, at least. Okay? And one more example, this is a classic study that came out a few years ago looking at US food consumption, looking at the average US diet, the average household diet in the United States, finding that only 4% of the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions are associated with transporting the food from the final producer to the retailer. 4%. In contrast, 83% of the greenhouse gas emissions are associated with making the food. So if the way in which you make the food is highly impactful, it really doesn't matter where you make it. It's a bad choice. And if the food you make is made in such a way that it has very low emissions in the production stage, then again, it doesn't really matter how or where you transport it. It's a good choice from a greenhouse gas perspective, with the exception of air freight. Lobster flown in from the East Coast, I don't care how they make it, it's a bad choice. Grapes flown in from Chile, bad choice. Anything on an airplane from a greenhouse gas perspective is going to be a bad choice. But most food is not transported by air.